I returned from Nepal to find my backyard transformed into a graveyard by my power-hungry HOA, only to discover they'd unearthed my grandfather's secret FBI documents buried beneath my toolshed. When Agent Jackson revealed I legally owned the intellectual property the FBI had been using for decades, I had to wonder, just how far would Karen Thompson and her minions go when they realized they'd picked the wrong homeowner to mess with? My suitcase thudded onto the porch as I fumbled for my house keys. After a year studying with monks in Nepal, I couldn't wait to see my garden. The flight had been long, my muscles ached, and all I wanted was to collapse into my own bed. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of shovels digging into the earth. I rushed around the side of my house and froze. 5 strangers in matching blue vests were digging holes all over my backyard. My beautiful roses were gone, my vegetable patch destroyed. In their place stood small granite markers arranged in neat rows. "What are you doing?" I shouted, dropping my backpack. "Get off my property!" The workers looked up, confused. A woman in a crisp pantsuit marched toward me, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me, but this is now Pine Crest Gardens Memorial Grounds," she said, pushing designer sunglasses up her nose. "You can't be here." Before I could respond, my neighbor Margaret came running across the street, her gray curls bouncing. "Thank goodness you're back," she cried. "I've been calling and emailing you for months." The pantsuit woman frowned. "Margaret, you know this person?" Margaret grabbed my arm. "This is the owner. This is whose house and land this is." The woman's face went blank, then slowly reddened. "That's impossible. The HOA determined this property was abandoned after 6 months of no contact." I pulled out my phone, showing her my travel documents. "I've been on a sabbatical in Nepal. I paid all my bills in advance and notified the post office." "That doesn't matter," she snapped. "HOA bylaws clearly state—" "I'm sorry," I interrupted. "But who are you?" Margaret answered before she could. "This is Karen Thompson. She became HOA president 3 months after you left." Karen straightened her jacket. "As I was saying, according to bylaw 47B, properties deemed abandoned can be repurposed for community needs. We voted unanimously." My head spun as I surveyed the destruction of my yard. 12 years of gardening, gone. The Japanese maple my mother had planted, the herb spiral I built stone by stone, all replaced with these grave markers. "Are those headstones?" I asked, horror creeping into my voice. Karen had the audacity to look proud. "Memorial markers. We've been selling plots to community members who want to remember their loved ones or reserve spaces for themselves. It's been quite profitable." "Profitable?" I felt my hands shaking. "You're selling pieces of my property." "Community property now," Karen corrected, checking her watch. "Now, if you'll excuse me, we have the Peterson Memorial Service at 3. You'll need to leave." I stood my ground. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, my land, and I have the deed to prove it." Karen signaled to a man in a security uniform. "Hank, please escort this person off the premises." Margaret stepped between us. "Karen, you can't do this. I told you months ago the owner was traveling." "Your input was noted at the meeting, Margaret," Karen said coldly. "The vote was still unanimous." As Hank approached, looking uncomfortable, I noticed something strange behind where my garden shed once stood. A different kind of digging was happening. Men in dark jackets were carefully removing something from the ground, placing items in clear plastic bags. "What's happening over there?" I demanded. "Where's my shed?" Karen's expression changed. Something flashed across her face. Fear. "That's a separate matter. We found irregularities during the initial excavation." Margaret leaned close to me. "They found something buried under your shed," she whispered. "The FBI has been here for 3 days." "The FBI? Under my shed?" My grandfather's warning echoed in my head. Never move the shed. Never dig there. What's buried stays buried. I'd always thought he was being dramatic. Karen was speaking into her phone now, shooting nervous glances my way. "Yes, the owner has returned." "Yes, unexpected." "No, they don't appear to know about the discovery." One of the men in dark jackets looked up, noticed me, and began walking over. As he got closer, I could see the letters FBI on his jacket. "Miss Thompson, we need to speak with the property owner," he said firmly. Karen pointed at me, her finger trembling slightly. Apparently, this is them. The agent turned to me, expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. I'm Special Agent Jackson. We need to talk about what we found beneath your property. I've been gone for a year, I said. I have no idea what's happening. Nevertheless, he replied, what we've uncovered appears to date back to the 1940s. Did you know your grandfather worked for the federal government? Of course I knew. Grandpa told endless stories about his government work, though he was always vague about the details. He'd left me the house with strict instructions about the yard, instructions I'd foolishly ignored. He mentioned it, I said carefully. Agent Jackson gestured toward his colleagues. We found a waterproof box containing documents marked classified, very old but still technically sealed government property. Karen stepped forward, clipboard raised like a shield. This discovery further justifies our community's claim to this land. Clearly, there are national security issues at stake. Agent Jackson gave her a look that could freeze lava. Ma'am, this is now a federal investigation. The HOA has no jurisdiction. As Karen sputtered protests, Margaret squeezed my arm. They found something else too, she whispered. Before the FBI came, Karen told everyone not to talk about it. A chill ran down my spine as Agent Jackson handed me his card. We'll need you to come in for questioning tomorrow morning. In the meantime, don't discuss this with anyone. As he walked away, Karen's phone rang again. Her face paled as she listened. What do you mean we don't have proper permits for the memorial garden? We're the HOA. We don't need... She stopped, listening. What document from 1947? That's impossible. She glared at me with such hatred I took a step back. This isn't over, she hissed before storming off toward a group of confused-looking memorial service attendees. Margaret helped me gather my bags. Come stay with me tonight. Your utilities might be off, and honestly, I don't trust Karen not to try something. As we walked to Margaret's house, I glanced back at my transformed yard, at the FBI agents carefully excavating beneath where my shed once stood, at Karen furiously making calls. Margaret, I asked quietly, what exactly did they find before the FBI came? Margaret looked around nervously before answering. A metal box with your grandfather's name on it. Inside were photos of your grandfather with J. Edgar Hoover and documents about something called Project Insight. Karen opened it before realizing what it was. My grandfather with the founder of the FBI? Project Insight? None of this made sense. There's something else, Margaret added as we reached her door. The deed they found from 1947, it wasn't just for the house. She lowered her voice to barely a whisper. It gave your family ownership rights to something the government still uses today. Our timeline? What developments? I asked, accepting the coffee Margaret offered. Agent Jackson took a seat across from me, his expression serious. The documents we recovered trace back to the founding of modern FBI forensic methods. Your grandfather wasn't just any employee. He established our first forensic science division. I nearly choked on my coffee. Grandpa never mentioned that. He just said he worked for the government. Many early employees maintained strict secrecy, Jackson nodded. But that's not why I'm here. He placed a folder on the coffee table. We found your grandfather's will among the buried items. It's quite unusual. Inside the folder was a yellow document sealed with government watermarks. My hands trembled as I read, to my descendants, I leave not only my property and possessions, but the rightful ownership of all methods, processes, and intellectual frameworks cataloged in Project Insight. The U.S. government maintains perpetual license to use these methods conditional upon proper acknowledgement of ownership and reasonable compensation. I looked up, confused. What does this mean? It means, Jackson said slowly, that your family technically owns the intellectual property rights to forensic methods the FBI has been using for over 70 years. Margaret gasped. I couldn't speak. According to our legal team's preliminary assessment, Jackson continued, your grandfather structured this arrangement so that ownership would remain private but compensated. Records indicate payments stopped in the 1970s when your family couldn't be located after your grandfather died. My mind reeled. So the FBI owes my family money? Potentially substantial sums, he acknowledged, but that creates complications with your current situation. Through the window, I saw Karen Thompson and 3 men in suits marching toward Margaret's house. That would be the HOA lawyer and a real estate developer, Agent Jackson muttered, checking his watch. Right on schedule. The doorbell rang. Margaret hesitated, but I nodded for her to answer. Karen burst in, followed by the suits. There you are, she snapped at me. Your presence is requested at an emergency HOA meeting this afternoon. We're voting on the final disposition of your former property. Former? I challenged. I still hold the deed. One of the suits stepped forward. Harold Mears, HOA attorney. According to bylaw 47B, your property was legally transferred to community ownership after 6 months of abandonment. I didn't abandon it, I countered. I was on sabbatical and had paid everything in advance. Unfortunately, Mears continued smoothly, notification requirements in Section 12A were fulfilled when notices were posted on your door and published in local papers without response. The transfer proceeded legally. Karen smiled triumphantly. The Memorial Garden stays. Agent Jackson cleared his throat. Actually, there's a federal interest in this property that supersedes HOA bylaws. Karen's smile faltered. This is a local matter. Not anymore, Jackson replied, producing his badge. The items recovered relate to ongoing federal operations and fall under national security protections. The second suit, clearly alarmed, asked, What items? The HOA wasn't informed. Exactly, I interjected. You began digging without proper archaeological surveys or permits, disturbing historically significant artifacts? Karen's face reddened. We followed all required procedures, including permits for establishing a commercial cemetery. A commercial cemetery? I asked innocently. The third suit, clearly the developer, paled. Commercial? You said this was a community memorial garden, not a commercial venture. Karen shot him a warning look. It's a community service with suggested donations for maintenance. Interesting, Agent Jackson mused, because we have records of payment transactions to Pinecrest Gardens HOA for memorial plots totaling over $200,000 in the past 3 months. Harold Mears adjusted his tie nervously. I should review those transactions before further discussion. You do that, I said. Meanwhile, I've been reviewing something myself. I pulled out my phone, showing emails I had discovered in my inbox overnight. These messages from concerned neighbors, sent while I was away, mention you specifically rejected their information about my travel plans. Karen, Margaret stepped forward, voice trembling. I told the entire board he was in Nepal. I showed them the farewell email with contact information. Karen's composure cracked. The board voted. It's done. Under false pretenses, I replied, you deliberately withheld information to get your memorial garden approved. The developer looked between Karen and me. Is this true? Of course not, Karen snapped. This is all a misunderstanding that we can resolve at the emergency meeting. About that meeting, Agent Jackson interjected, federal agents will be present to discuss the classified materials recovered and the implications of disturbing a protected historical site. Karen's phone buzzed. She checked it, and her face went from red to white. Problem? I asked. Nothing, she said too quickly. But I glimpsed the message on her screen. We know about the money. Meeting canceled. The developer checked his own phone and frowned. I've just received notice that all Pinecrest HOA accounts have been frozen pending investigation. Karen's eyes darted around like a cornered animal. That's impossible. On whose authority? Mine, said a new voice from the doorway. We all turned to see an older woman in a formal black suit, flanked by 2 more agents. Agent Jackson stood straighter. Director Morris, we weren't expecting you personally. The director nodded briefly to Jackson before fixing her gaze on me. When a report crossed my desk that David Williams's gridded notes had been found, I had to come myself. Your grandfather saved my father's career with his forensic innovations. She turned to Karen, who had gone completely pale. As for the frozen accounts, that's standard procedure when we discover misappropriation of federal funds. Federal funds? Karen stammered. We haven't touched any federal money. Director Morris smiled thinly. The moment you sold the first plot on this property, you were misappropriating federally protected assets. The intellectual property alone is valued in the millions. The room went silent as Karen sank into a chair, her empire crumbling before her eyes. What happens now? I asked quietly. The director handed me a thick folder. That's up to you. Inside is everything we know about your grandfather's work, the property's historical significance, and your options moving forward. As I took the folder, I noticed a small key taped to the inside cover with a note in my grandfather's handwriting. For the hidden room beneath the rose garden, some secrets are worth protecting, some are meant to be revealed. Choose wisely. I looked up in shock. There's a hidden room under where they've been digging graves? My hands trembled as I opened the door to find a tall man in a crisp suit standing on my porch. The silver badge he flashed caught the evening light. Good evening. Agent Jackson, FBI. We need to talk about what was found on your property. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped aside, inviting him in while trying to hide my racing heart. Grandpa's warning echoed in my mind. Never let anyone see these papers. Not even people who say they're from the government. Agent Jackson's shoes clicked against my hardwood floor as he followed me to the living room. Family photos lined the walls, including one of Grandpa shaking hands with men in old-fashioned suits. Is that Harold Mitchell? Agent Jackson asked, stopping abruptly at the photo. My grandfather, I nodded. How did you know? Every FBI agent learns about Harold Mitchell during training, he said. Agent Jackson's eyes widened. Wait, you're Harold Mitchell's grandchild? I gestured toward the couch. Please sit. Would you like some coffee? While I prepared drinks in the kitchen, I watched Agent Jackson through the doorway. He studied the room carefully, his gaze lingering on Grandpa's old desk in the corner. As I returned with the mugs, Jackson finally spoke. Those documents the HOA uncovered, they detailed founding operational procedures still partly in use today. Your grandfather created the blueprint for how we investigate crimes. I set down the cups harder than I intended. Those papers belong to my family. The HOA had no right to dig them up, or to call you. Actually, Jackson said, leaning forward, they didn't call us. A contractor recognized some government seals and reported it. He hesitated. But here's what I don't understand. Why were classified documents buried under your tool shed? My heart pounded. This moment would decide everything. I walked to Grandpa's desk, unlocked the hidden drawer, and removed the leather folder I had never shown anyone before. Before my grandfather died, he gave me these. I placed the folder on the coffee table. His will, the deed to this property, and documentation transferring ownership of all his intellectual property to me. He said someday someone might come looking, and I should be ready. Jackson carefully examined each document, his expression growing more shocked with every page. The legal language was crystal clear. Harold Mitchell had retained ownership rights to his methods and innovations, licensing them to the government with specific terms. Jackson finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Ma'am, do you realize what this means? The FBI has been using proprietary methods that legally belong to you for decades. The room fell silent as we both processed this revelation. Through my window, I noticed Karen and her husband, Tom, standing across the street, watching my house with their phones pressed to their ears. Your HOA friends seem very interested in my visitor, I said, nodding toward the window. Agent Jackson glanced outside and frowned. I recognize that behavior. They're calling everyone they know with connections, trying to figure out what's happening. He gathered the documents carefully. The HOA has no idea who they're messing with, and neither did we until today. As he prepared to leave, Jackson paused at the door. Miss Mitchell, what do you want from this situation? You could make things very difficult for the Bureau. I want my property restored and the HOA to leave me alone, I answered honestly. I don't want money or trouble. I just want my home back. Jackson nodded slowly. I need to take these documents to my superiors. This changes everything about our approach. He handed me his card. Don't speak to anyone else about this until you hear from me. And whatever you do, don't give the HOA any more information. As his car pulled away, neighbors peeked from behind their curtains. Margaret hurried over from next door, concern written across her face. What did the FBI want? She whispered. Karen's telling everyone you're being investigated for something terrible. For the first time in days, I smiled. Actually, Margaret, it looks like my grandfather left me more than just this house. He left me a way to fight back. That night, I couldn't sleep. The knowledge that I held legal leverage against both the FBI and the HOA filled me with both power and anxiety. What would Grandpa want me to do with this unexpected inheritance? The answer came just before dawn, along with a new determination. The HOA thought they could bully me because I lived alone and kept to myself. They were about to discover how wrong they were. What no one knew was that before my sabbatical in Nepal, I had worked as a paralegal for 15 years. The legal documents spread across my bed weren't just family heirlooms. They were weapons in a battle I suddenly felt equipped to win. As the first light of day crept through my windows, I began to formulate a plan that would make Grandpa proud. But would I be brave enough to see it through when Karen Thompson and her HOA allies unleashed their full power against me? The bright red, refused stamp across my cease and desist letter made my blood boil. Karen's handwritten note at the bottom read, "The Pinecrest Gardens HOA has unanimously voted to fine you $500 daily until you stop interfering with community improvements. Please respect the wishes of your neighbors." I crumpled the paper, watching through my kitchen window as an elderly couple placed flowers beside a small headstone in what used to be my vegetable garden. The transformation of my backyard continued despite my protests. Benches installed, pathways laid, even a small fountain erected where my bird bath once stood. The ringing phone interrupted my anger. It was Agent Jackson. "Miss Mitchell, are you free to meet today? My superiors would like to discuss a proposal." 2 hours later, I sat in a downtown office building across from three people: Jackson, a woman introduced as the FBI's legal counsel, and a silver-haired man who commanded the room without speaking. "Ms. Mitchell," the older man began, "I'm Director Campbell. I knew your grandfather many years ago." He slid a folder across the table. "We verified your ownership claims. The methods Harold developed and documented remain fundamental to our work, and you're legally entitled to compensation." The lawyer spoke next. "We're prepared to offer you a substantial settlement for retroactive licensing plus ongoing royalties." "I don't want money," I replied, surprising myself with my confidence. "I want my property restored," and the HOA stopped. "They're destroying my home while hiding behind community bylaws." Director Campbell exchanged glances with his colleagues. "What if we could help with both problems? Your grandfather was important to this organization. We protect our own, and that extends to their families." The proposal they outlined was unprecedented. The FBI would help me reclaim my property in exchange for fair licensing rights to Grandpa's methods. They would investigate the HOA's actions for potential legal violations, while keeping my ownership of the intellectual property confidential. "We can't directly intervene in a neighborhood dispute," Jackson explained, "but we can look into permit violations, possible destruction of historically significant artifacts, and misrepresentation in official documents." As I drove home, my mind raced with possibilities. For the first time since returning, I felt hope. The sunset painted the sky orange as I turned onto my street, only to find Tom Thompson standing in my driveway, his face flushed with anger. I parked and stepped out cautiously. "Can I help you, Mr. Thompson?" "Whatever you're doing, stop it now," he shouted, stepping closer. "Karen received 3 calls from Washington today, people asking questions about permits and historical registrations." I crossed my arms. "That sounds like a you problem." His jaw clenched. "You have no idea who you're messing with?" I smiled. "Actually, Tom, I think it's the other way around." Neighbors' curtains twitched in surrounding houses as I stood my ground, remembering Director Campbell's advice. Don't show fear. These types of bullies expected it. "I'm simply protecting what belongs to me," I replied calmly. "Perhaps the HOA should have researched this property before digging it up." Tom's finger jabbed toward my face. "Listen carefully. Karen has connections you wouldn't believe. This neighborhood runs because of her work. You're nothing but a—" "Mr. Thompson." Agent Jackson's voice cut through the tension as he appeared beside my car. I hadn't even heard him pull up. "We need to discuss your HOA's unauthorized excavation of federal property," he said. Tom's face drained of color. "Federal property? What are you talking about? Who are you?" Jackson showed his badge. "Your HOA disturbed a site containing historically significant materials related to the founding of the FBI. Materials that were intentionally secured there by Harold Mitchell himself." I watched Tom's aggressive posture collapse. "This This is ridiculous. It's just a regular house in a regular neighborhood. Is it? Jackson pointed to my roof. That weather vane isn't decorative. It's an old FBI marker designating safe houses. Your HOA should have checked property records more carefully before voting to convert it. Tom backed away, nearly tripping. This isn't over, he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow. After he left, I turned to Jackson. There's no FBI marker on my roof. There is now, he replied with the faintest smile. Installed this morning while you were meeting with the director. Sometimes perception matters more than reality. That night, emergency text alerts pinged through the neighborhood, announcing a mandatory HOA meeting the following evening. Margaret called me immediately. Karen's furious, she said. She's telling everyone you've threatened the neighborhood with the government. Some people are scared. I thanked her for the warning and spent the night preparing. The documents I found in Grandpa's hidden safe behind the basement bookshelf told a story even the FBI didn't fully know. A property purchased specifically to hide evidence of early bureau operations too controversial to document officially. The next morning, Mrs. Fitzgerald, a widow in her 70s, stood in my yard, placing flowers on what she called her grandson's plot. When I approached, her eyes filled with tears. Please don't take this away, she begged. Karen promised we could remember our lost loved ones here. My Tommy has no other memorial. My anger at the HOA faltered, seeing her grief. Mrs. Fitzgerald, I'm so sorry about your grandson, but this isn't a real cemetery. There's nobody buried here. It feels real to me, she whispered. Karen said you were away so long, you didn't care about this land anymore. Her words hit me hard. Had my year away made the neighborhood think I'd abandoned my home? Had Karen deliberately targeted my property because she thought I wouldn't return to fight? I helped Mrs. Fitzgerald arrange her flowers, then gently explained that while I couldn't allow my entire yard to remain a fake cemetery, I would support creating a proper memorial garden in the community park. Really? You'd do that? Even after everything? Her surprise made my heart ache. This isn't about punishing people who miss their loved ones, I assured her. It's about stopping those who abuse power. As she left, I noticed Tom Thompson taking photos from his car. The HOA was gathering ammunition for tonight's meeting. I needed to be ready. Mid-afternoon, Agent Jackson called. We found something interesting in the county records. The original property survey from 1947 shows your land extends 15 feet beyond the current fence, including the area the HOA uses for their annual duck race fundraiser. I smiled as a plan formed in my mind. That's fascinating. Would you happen to have a copy of that survey I could bring to tonight's meeting? Already on your port, he replied, along with some other documents you might find useful. Director Campbell sends his regards. The package contained exactly what I needed. But as I prepared, doubt crept in. Was I taking this too far? Would fighting the HOA this way make me just as bad as them? Then I found the final item in the package, a newspaper clipping from 1947. My grandfather stood beside a newly planted oak tree in my yard. The caption read, FBI Forensics Pioneer Creates Community Memorial for Agents, Lost in the Line of Duty. My property had indeed been a memorial once, a real one, with purpose and meaning, not Karen's manipulative fake graveyard. Tonight would determine whether I could reclaim that authentic history or lose my home forever to the HOA's power grab. Cameras flashed as I walked into the Pine Crest Gardens Community Center. The emergency HOA meeting had drawn a bigger crowd than expected. 3 local news vans were parked outside. Karen's attempt to handle this quietly had backfired completely. That's her, someone whispered, the one fighting the graveyard. Karen stood at the podium, her knuckles white as she gripped the sides. Her perfect bob haircut seemed extra stiff today, just like her smile. Before we begin, she started, voice shaking slightly, I want to remind everyone that our community rules exist for a reason. Some people think they can disappear for a year and then question our decisions when they finally decide to come home. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I noticed Margaret giving me a thumbs up from the third row. President Thompson, I called out, maybe you should tell everyone about the certified letters I sent updating my address, or the dues payments that mysteriously weren't processed. Karen's face flushed red. This meeting isn't about mail, It's about one selfish homeowner trying to ruin a beautiful memorial garden that's bringing comfort to dozens of families. Agent Jackson and two government lawyers stepped through the door behind me. Right on time. Actually, I said, standing up, this meeting is about something much bigger. Jackson connected his laptop to the projector. The room gasped as black and white photos filled the screen. My grandfather standing beside J. Edgar Hoover, cutting ribbons, receiving medals. What you're looking at, I explained, is classified history. My grandfather established the FBI's Forensic Division in 1947. As thanks, the government deeded our family that specific plot of land because of what lies beneath it. Karen lunged for the microphone. This is ridiculous. She's making this up. Agent Jackson stepped forward. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Special Agent Jackson with the FBI. I can confirm everything being said is accurate. More concerning is what our preliminary investigation has uncovered. The lawyer beside him opened a folder. The HOA proceeded with excavation without proper permits. You disturbed protected historical artifacts. And most seriously, we have evidence suggesting HOA leadership falsified documentation claiming the property was abandoned. Tom Thompson jumped up. You can't prove any of that. Actually, we can, I said quietly, nodding to Margaret. She stood up, holding a thick folder. My neighbor has kept copies of every HOA meeting minute for the past decade, including the one where you, Tom, suggested using forged paperwork to seize my property after I rejected your lowball offer to buy it last year. The room erupted. Neighbors turned on each other. Some defended Karen, others demanded answers. Enough! Karen screamed, her composure completely gone. This neighborhood was perfect before you came back. You mean before you started abusing power, I corrected. Agent Jackson cleared his throat. Given the historical significance of the site and the evidence of wrongdoing, the federal government is prepared to invoke eminent domain on the entire Pinecrest Gardens property. The room fell silent. The government lawyer added, however, we're willing to limit our action to the improperly seized property, provided HOA leadership immediately changes hands and all memorial fixtures are removed within 30 days. Karen collapsed into her chair, face buried in her hands. Tom stormed out. Margaret stood up. I nominate our rightful neighbor for HOA president, someone who actually understands property rights. Hands shot up across the room. As the vote concluded, Jackson leaned over. Your grandfather's work saved countless lives. He'd be proud of you. I watched Karen slip out the back door, her perfect world crumbling around her. This wasn't just about my backyard anymore. It was about truth, justice, and making sure no one in Pinecrest Gardens ever had to worry about their land being stolen again.